All Things Data podcast. In the spirit of Daniel Kahneman, Peter Diamandis, and Google Moonshots, brings together leading data scientists, technologists, business model experts, and futurists to discuss how to utilize, harness, and deploy data science and data-driven strategies to enable digital transformation. The hosts are Dr. Manjeet Rege, Associate Professor of Data Science, and Dan Yarmoluk, Director of Business Development of IoT and Data Science.
Hi, you're listening to the All Things Data podcast. My name is Manjeet Rege, and I'm joined with my co-host, Dan Yarmoluk. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Manjeet. It's great to be here, and we got a great guest today. We have IgorJablokov, the CEO and founder of Pryon. Igor is named an industry luminary by Speech Technology magazine, and he previously founded Yap, the world's first high-accuracy, fully automated cloud platform for voice recognition. After its products were deployed by dozens of enterprises, the company became Amazon's first AI-related acquisition, and they served as the nucleus for follow-on products such as Alexa, Exo, and Fire TV. As a program director at IBM, Igor led a team that designed the precursor to Watson and developed the first multimodal web browser. Welcome, Igor.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's a very storied history and background. Can you tell me a little bit more about your background and what is your history with data and artificial intelligence?
Sure. So I started my career at IBM Microelectronics, and halfway through that, I started working and leading a team that was focused more on multimodal research. It was basically how do we blend visual, voice, and create more organic experiences for end users. Some of the things that we were trialing were to put AI assistants on phones. So in Australia, they were launching some of the first 3G platforms where they had postage stamps size video conferences driving that product to market, but they felt that they needed to do a bit more. And so they were already thinking about how to use AI assistants in that. I had an idea to put a microphone on top of a PlayStation, which was jointly developed by Sony, Toshiba, and IBM. And we were soundly laughed out of the room, and because why would anybody put a microphone in their house? You know, in hindsight, that was a miscalculation of epic proportions. We also looked at how cumbersome it was to install speech recognition engines in most corporate environments. They didn't have the capability to do that, and there was no way to share the data in order to enhance accuracy. And so we had an idea to make a hosted service for those capabilities. And that was also nixed because they felt no company worth their salt would ever reveal their private customer data to outside of their data centers. And so it was through all of those fits and starts and experimentations and blocks that we ended up starting that last company. Within a year of it being founded, we were secretly designed into a prototype iPhone before they acquired Siri. That's how early the Apple team was trying to wrap their minds around more natural interfaces on their platform. So I have to give them a lot of credit on that. We had some of the early folks that worked on iPod engineering that formed the nucleus of our technology team back then. And so that's how we were able to do that behind the scenes in secret while publicly going to the first ever TechCrunch conference and showing baby Alexa on a Motorola flip phone. And nobody knew what we were showing at that point in time. And as a result, we just took a step back, created the speech cloud, and just allowed developers of all types to access it. And by the end of the experience, as you mentioned, we had a mess of enterprise and carrier customers, including Sprint and Microsoft. What's interesting about the current company's name, Pryon, Pryon, is that it was the code name of the speech engine that was at our core that ended up migrating itself to Amazon.
That's interesting. So with your current endeavor, what are you trying to solve?
Well, I wouldn't have to solve it if Amazon, Google, and Microsoft were solving it already. And what I noticed is, typically there's always a sonic boom in enterprise markets, right? Once something is de-risked as an interaction method in the consumer space, it ends up going to work. But it doesn't go to work the way that we expected, because for it to go to work, it has to have certain integrations, certain security features baked into it and otherwise in order to be adopted in a heterogeneous environment. Things are a lot more complex. if you take the 23andMe of any business, many of them, especially the largest ones, were born through M&A. And so they have bits and pieces from a multitude of different vendors. It's not as simple as getting an AI assistant to work at home, where a typical household buys into the Amazon ecosystem, the Google one, or the Apple one. And so it's a bit easier to get that stuff working together.
That's a fantastic point, Igor. In my world of industrial kind of AI, it is disparate systems and vertical expertise and automation at the most mundane points. And the complexity is born out of process and people and what we call right data, right time, in the right format, the right people, right? So the obsession has been on the mundane, but I think it has far-reaching implications, and it is an integration game at the end of the day of disparate data silos. So when I was investigating Pryon, I could see that. So this would be a virtual kind of agent, right? And it could kind of attach or integrate those various disparate data silos to kind of serve it up in a much more efficient manner. Is that a way to articulate it? I'm probably simplifying it. But.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We care about employee experiences and we care about customer experiences, right? The stuff that's inside of the firewall and the stuff that's outside of the firewall, and trying to find overarching architecture to support both. The other thing is, at home, when we do these queries on Amazon Echo and otherwise, there's a lot of structured data that we're accessing, right? News, weather, sports, and the like, whereas there's a lot of unstructured content in these enterprises as well, and they just sit there as dark pools of data that nobody really knows how to wrap their minds around. It's all the stuff that we do in collaboration, in our emails, documents of all forms and fashion. And so it's a little bit more complex to integrate that data together with, as you said, IoT data and things coming out of your ERP and CRM, so on and so forth. It's a little bit more, that's an understatement, of course. It's a little bit more of a challenge. It's a massive challenge, but it's a thrilling one to be tackling. No one company can tackle it. This is why, what was born out of Web 2.0 was an API-driven ecosystem where all of these things would attach to each other, and you saw the rise of RPAs to try to act as a service bus to interconnect all of these things.
As we talk about the rise of exponential technologies, and we can see the enabling environments of collaboration, the cloud. What's your thoughts, Igor? Is how long is this going to take to really see the benefits of this kind of NLP, enterprise AI, stitching together this digital helix in a way that's meaningful? What's your trajectory here? What do you think?
I think everybody's expecting to walk into a workplace in 2020 and start seeing Minority Report style experiences. When in reality, the way that innovation works is in many ways invisible. If you go to any town center, you're going to see a gleaming 21st century glass building, a skyscraper next to an old dilapidated church. And so that's what typically happens with adoption of technologies. There's going to be so much legacy gear still in these enterprises, while at the same time, you'll see different aspects of their ecosystem evolving and getting more sophisticated. So it's not going to be this thing that's going to be obvious all at once.
And we have a lot of things that are forces that are working here. It's like Red Hat, right? In the sense that we have open source, we have crowd. Again, we have collaboration, legacy infrastructures and systems. Kind of migrating that is just a lot of work, and I think there's a lot of work in the weeds. As much as we have these beautiful enabling machine learning algorithms or ways to even do fantastic, difficult problems like NLP in and of itself, still the data and the meaning of the data and then getting it into a holistic kind of big data play is just such a large task that I think is minimized. Like you're saying, we think it's Minority Report, but we just got to get into the weeds of data cleansing and integrity and learning how to deal with it. At the same time, I'm very excited. It's just there's such a load to get through. So when you talk about use cases for Pryon, right, and some examples, how do you confront that? How do you deal with it?
Well, the other thing is, what are our expectations for the output from these AIs too, right? Because everybody's saying, hey, we want there to be no bias, and we want transparency and explainability, and we want this, and we want that, and we want deterministic outcomes. especially if we're in highly regulated industries. We wanted to deal with ambiguities, but give us a proper way forward that's actionable. And yet humans would look at a picture of a dress and can't tell if it's one color or another anyway. So in some ways, we forget that all of these technologies are human born and human created. Our own faults and our own inconsistencies end up getting baked in the software as well. And that's just par for the course. The most effective technology leaders are the ones that know how to live in the center of that maelstrom of chaos and just marshal it forward. So things are constantly improving day by day. So this isn't like the computer programs that we used to write 10, 20, 30 years ago, where you literally had something transforming from a 0 to a 1. This is a bit more fluid. This is a bit more dynamic, sort of like what I call, remember the past of all of the fuzzy logic. It still worked. It had the outcome. You just had to trust the math, that it was going to stop a train carefully and slowly.
In terms of the impact of AI on an average employee, how would it change a regular workday for an employee?
Well, a lot of it has to do, if we even talk about just unstructured data. Right now, all of us collectively that are listening to this podcast read the equivalent of 250 pages or worth of unstructured content in order to maintain ourselves. In the next 5 years, that's predicted to go up by 10x, the equivalent of 2,500 pages or 40 hours worth of reading. Well, you're not going to be able to do that without some form of augmented intelligence keeping up with you. I think right now there's going to be subtle changes where we're seeing lots of vertical AIs getting dropped into these enterprise environments, and they're not surprising, right? They're going after workflows such as contract management, being an example. You see a lot of them getting deployed in security services, right? Defending us from various threats, whether they're in our email or otherwise. They're guarding our phone lines to see if people are fraudulently trying to perform wire transfers against our companies. And so a lot of the use of AI today, I think, are more in back-end processes that are invisible to folks. And counterintuitively, when you actually look at what all of us collectively do on a daily basis, for the most part, it's remarkably similar to what we were doing 10 or 20 years ago. We're still using Microsoft Office. The only thing that changed, it's still aspirin, but it's injected instead of taken by mouth. All they did was they changed the delivery method of the very same thing. I think to have true breakthroughs in user experiences, Office will have to disappear into its component parts. Mm-hmm. And you won't even care that you're looking at half document, half spreadsheet, half PowerPoint Chimera. It's just going to be the content centric. And then it transforms itself based on the endpoint or the application of that information.
Igor, that was a very, very interesting point you put on, that the average person reads about 250 pages of unstructured content for 4 hours. So for some of the business listeners and not the data science listeners, could you kind of expand on that? Well, what do you mean by 250 pages of unstructured content? Is that like web pages or, YouTube videos and it could, as a myriad, just...
Yeah, you're right. All of the above. So it's the emails we read, the analyst reports, the news articles, other types of digital media that we consume. If you actually timed yourself, you're spending about 4 hours of your day doing that. That's a tremendous burden in some ways, but it's a necessary burden. That's why we're knowledge workers. What's even more surprising, if you think that it's fantastical that we would go up by 10x, we typically get guided. For instance, one of our trial sites is a hospital system, and their chief medical officer says, listen, our industry's average is that the amount of content that we have to deal with because of expanding regulation, new therapies, new procedures, and whatnot, doubles in size every 72 or 73 days. They can't keep up.
Yeah, well, I used to work at IMS Health, and prior to the cloud and data centers today, and it was prescription data, right? And it was disease trend data. And you're right, it was the biggest data center at the time on-prem next to the U.S. government.
Think of all the access issues even to that content. One of the things that they guided me is they said, listen, why don't you ask your primary care physician for how far back in the notes that they go whenever you visit with them, and you'll rarely see anybody go back more than 2 visits. And yet we have all of that content that's being programmed into these EHRs. They don't even have effective user experiences to go back in time and see that there was evidence of risk for yourself that was maybe a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago, and they don't even leverage the content that they have.
How does Pryon utilize data?
The way that we envision utilizing data is in formats that aren't technologically sophisticated. So I want to allow actual end users to use Pryon and not worry about data scientists and everybody else. We can use all the newfangled tools. We're comfortable in AWS. We're comfortable using things like Algolia and what have you, with all of the tools that are getting invented for us as subject matter experts. But the biggest trick, and that was always Apple's expertise, is how do you take a very sophisticated piece of technology and bring it to laypersons? And the way to bring it to laypersons is basically you need to connect to the systems that they already know how to use. So there should be no end user behavioral changes. That's one of the biggest themes for us, is if you live in collaboration tools, if you live in cloud storage, if you live in other discovery tools, you should be able to have Pryon fairy dust sprinkled inside of that, and it becomes invisible to you that there's an AI doing a lot more for you behind the scenes. Our vision is to not necessarily upset the apple cart and bring them, a new thing that they have to learn. And that's been the power of natural language anyway, right? Because if you look at the last, 10, 20, 30 years, a small subset of us became mathematicians, computer scientists, computer engineers, electrical engineers, and what have you. We could program in assembly. We can program in other computer languages. We learned how to speak like machines. Now, I think there is a democratization of access to these systems, because you will have a situation in the future where people will be able to program computers through natural language and literally tell the system, as you mentioned before, to all of the business listeners out there, you'll just be able to tell a computer what you want programmatically, and it'll go ahead and write the program for you. And maybe it gets validated by somebody that's in our field that understands more of the arcane attributes of connectors and integrations and things like that. But at one point, everybody's going to be able to program just by telling the machine, what they want. Hey, I need this demographic data from the state of Minnesota, and then I need this data from that bank, and I need this data from the hospital, and I need it to be transformed this way, and I need this style of report to come out, and I need it to come out every Tuesday at 8 p.m. to be ready for a board meeting on Wednesday. That's what they'll be speaking into the system, and they'll just hop to and get it done.
And how far away are we from that?
Actually, a lot of the things that we talk about sound like science fiction, but all the fundamental building blocks are here. The Lego bricks are there. Nobody has a recipe to it yet. There has to be a business case associated with building such a system, but all the pieces are there. It's just a question of integrating them together.
So are we somewhat closer to generalized intelligence as opposed to what we currently have, making strides in certain use cases, but we are nowhere close to generalized yet? Do you think that may happen in the next 5 years or so?
I think what you'll see is architectures that will feel like generalized AI, but they won't be generalized AI. To truly have generalized AI, I think requires a different sort of support system as far as the underlying hardware. And that's, probably further in the future, but you'll have things that start feeling like it.
Can you talk a little bit about AI reality in terms of its capability today and the hype around it? Sometimes inflated expectations, and as a result, it may lead to disappointments. And then there is the truth to it. I mean, what AI truly can do today.
Yeah, I think we've all seen the raft of startups that are building that call themselves AI startups, but meanwhile, they're just building on top of primitives that exist at Azure and AWS and Google Cloud. none of us that were in the field called it AI. It just ended up being something that the press started promoting. It was just an easier way for lay people to understand this, in the same way that even though we were one of the first, if not the first AI cloud company in the past, I didn't even know to call it cloud, right? It was very cumbersome. Well, it's client server, it's a hosted system, it's a SaaS system, it's all of these types of ways. But in public consciousness, the concept of cloud started taking off, and people understood that you had this endpoint and an access to remote resources. That's the same thing that's happening here with AI. I think people watch science fiction, whether it's television or film, and they're expecting that you have this sentient thing that's all seeing and all knowing. And in reality, these are highly vertical targeted things that are basically, taking information and transforming it with interesting algorithms and giving you, analytics, or moving a workflow, or they repackage this information so that you can have a user experience to extract knowledge, a la an AI assistant.
Igor, how is the user experience today with Pryon? What is the net result that you're able to stitch together?
That's interesting. As I mentioned, I want to exist where the users already are, right? So I'm not defining what the endpoints look like. People are on mobile. People are on their PCs. People work in contact centers, and people visit websites. So where those end users are is where we want to be. As far as the work behind the scenes, it ends up being this situation where we try to do the inverse of what the crowds are doing, right? So if everybody's building on top of certain off-the-shelf parts, with the major cloud vendors, we're going to be contrarian, right? So we have a technology team that has fundamentally built all forms of engines in the past: speech recognition engines, text-to-speech, dialogue managers, built machine translation engines, and the like. And so what's different about the team is that we're completely focused on independent delivery system for this type of technology. And that, I think, with vertical integration, it gets you new levels of accuracy, it gets you higher security and the like, which is similar to why an iPhone of 10 years ago and an iPhone of today are different. What Apple consistently does is it tries to own more of the hardware stack and certainly their own software stack as well, in order to get the best power management and the best performance. I think that's lost on a lot of AI startups that are basically calling themselves that, but they're just building models on top of existing engines, whereas we fundamentally go down to the engine level or lower and try to get everything to be purpose-built for our use cases.
No, there's a lot of talk about AI bias. At the same time, regulation around AI needs to be around. A number of well-known speakers have talked about the fact that AI needs to be regulated. You have this article which says, which talks about what politicians should know about AI debate, Igor. So can you talk a little bit about, in order for us to regulate, politicians need to have some knowledge about AI, and I think that's where we are running short of. So can you talk a little bit about that?
The majority of politicians don't know anything about AI, and so they're influenced by lobbyists. Well, let me ask you this question. Do you think big banks like regulation, or they despise it?
Well, I don't think they like it, right?
Actually, it's counterintuitive. I think they embrace it, and here's why. It creates a moat that makes it a lot harder for other folks to compete with them, right? If you look at all of this innovation happening in fintech, it's yet one more hurdle that they need to get through. I think when you have big tech companies that are worth $1 trillion, I think that they can get a little bit creative there, where they embrace certain forms of regulation as a moat, as increasing the friction required to compete with these incumbent businesses. And so that's why you see them changing their tune now to say, well, maybe we need to think about privacy here, we need to think about that, and we need to have privacy officers doing this and doing that. And it just changes the game for all of the new entrants in those particular fields. The pharmaceutical industry has done that effectively, where to take any therapy now and get it through trials is north of $1 billion. Well, that presents a huge barrier to entry for anybody that's coming in with a new medicine. As far as bias goes, again, it's humans are making these machines. It's not a perfect machine making its digital twin here. There's always going to be bias, and part of it is just the limited data that we have. Look at even medicines made for women. In many ways, are biased because the data sets in the majority testing was on males, even though it was targeted for females, which is ludicrous.
Do you think maybe having a balanced data set might be the way to avoid bias in many cases?
I think you're going to have rules-based engines still prevalent in highly regulated industry. We don't have surprises like Goldman Sachs and Apple Card experience with a couple getting 2 different credit limits, right? That's where people are saying it can't be a black box. We need to know exactly why these 2 different numbers came out of the system. As far as nobody can even agree what bias means, right? And so you can have a situation where you try to, intellectually solve it by understanding what are the component parts. For instance, if I describe the biography of a politician, just my choice of words are going to trend the biography positively or negatively. And so there's all sorts of research to figure out how do we choose the most neutral representation of that biography. In other ways, Google recently announced for their image recognition systems that they would no longer label genders because people look different than they express their gender as well. So they just throw their hands up and give up. So those are the two extremes.
Are there certain verticals that you're particularly interested in if people want to reach out and kind of understand more or experiment? How can they reach you? What are you looking at? Where are potentially in industries aligned with where you're going?
From the outset of this company, we took a strategic investment from Engage Ventures, which is a consortium that includes AT&T, Goldman Sachs, UPS, Delta Airlines, Georgia Pacific, Invesco, Home Depot, Chick-fil-A, and several other brands. We wanted the confidence that we were building something that was cross-industry. So much of AI gets targeted for specific niches because it's a lot harder to create a platform that's relevant to a multitude of different industries, whether they're in financial services, healthcare, energy, so on and so forth, retail. What we're building is similar to what we were building last time. The speech cloud was relevant to anyone. Right? It didn't matter if you were running a search business. It didn't matter if you had a messaging business. It didn't matter if you had a call mining business. It didn't matter if you were in automotive, so on and so forth. It was relevant to anyone, including set-top box makers and mobile device manufacturers, so on and so forth. And so history is repeating itself. We're more fascinated by creating a platform that's useful to a multitude of different industries. Because it's thrilling when you look at the different use cases that people can leverage the platform for, whether it is enabling enterprise workforces, whether they're office workers or in the field, whether it's pilots, whether it's healthcare providers. That for us is really fascinating.
That's great. So you encourage all industries to reach out.
When they actually see what this is, and we'll have a formal public announcement in the May timeframe, it'll be immediately obvious how this could be used across industry, and I think people will be surprised by it in some ways. It really is designed every industry, table stakes, and I think it's what we all expected to happen. I think we have a special situation where independent AI companies, as I describe our work, can provide farm-to-table data science, which is a funny little term. But when you look at local restaurants, what can they do? They literally could go and pick the freshest food and deliver it to a table for us. Same thing goes with AI. In many cases, when you look at a big tech company, there's so many, and the majority of our team came from these style companies. It takes a while until things get into production, whereas startups can iterate a lot faster and essentially get people things that are the newest form of capabilities. And that's why Wall Street essentially recommended, through their own cajoling, if you will, that big companies outsource their fundamental R&D to startups. This is why things are organized the way that they are, where you have this heady venture capital industry that invests in these experiments, and then big things happen to the ones that end up finding a winning formula in the market through M&A or IPO. And that's how our innovative ecosystem tends to be architected now, whereas in the past, you had, dominant companies such as Xerox PARC and Bell Labs and IBM Research and the like, being where the majority of these great things were being discovered. Now it's fragmented. There's a layer of venture capital on top of it, and you have accelerated innovation through all of that experimentation.
Fascinating, Igor. Last question: is there anything you feel is missing from the conversation you would like to articulate?
One of the things I think we talked about before is the majority of us got into this game to be technologists. And counterintuitive, we're actually getting brought into bigger macro discussions than we expected, right? Because people are asking us about, bias systems. They're asking us about election hacking. They're asking us about the future of cybersecurity. So in reality, more of us have to be aware about the impact of the technologies that we create to the ecosystems around us than we expected to be independently working in a quiet lab. Things like this venue, we all have to appreciate, because at least it's allowing us a safe place to discuss some of these themes that are all being addressed to us. And they're complicated issues, but I think for the most part, all of us are generally going in the right direction with them.
Yeah, that's a great point, Igor.
But, none of us even got in this game to make money. Literally, if I look at all of our collective CVs, the three of us speaking right now, none of us thought that there was going to be anything here. We just thought, hey, we're going to be building interesting and fun technologies the rest of our life. And who knew that now it's at the core of every industry? Who knew that every politician is going to be getting on a debate and talking about how our technology is going to be affecting every aspect of their personal and professional lives of all voters, right? Where it could even turn into a wedge issue at some point. And all the regulatory stuff, the election hacking stuff, all the stuff with respect to whether some nation states are misusing this technology, right? Like China with Bloomberg was asked whether the Chinese president is a dictator or not, and he has to tap dance around that as well. The fact that we have an AI policy that's basic. It looks like it's Mr. Rogers' AI policy. Meanwhile, when the president of China speaks at his biggest theme-setting speech, right, their version of the State of the Union, if you look behind him, they always hide that actually reinforce what the president is speaking of. That's the major themes. And there's a world leader that had an AI book sitting behind him. Mm-hmm. And so when he talks about that, when Putin says whoever solves AI ends up controlling the world, that's kind of dangerous stuff now.
I've done a lot of work in China. Totally agree with you, Igor, with regards to like how much muscle they're putting into it. It's a totally different game. The battlefield is not really clear, as to what's really happening and what's going on.
Well, this is why the Pryon engine that sits at the core of Alexa, we never patented the insides. Nobody knows how it works and why it works the way that it does. We never talk about it. There was a brand new architecture inside of it, but we didn't even bother ever publicly talking about how it works.
Is it a zero-sum game? Is it Chinese versus U.S., or are there models of collaboration such that that'll really go down well beyond data privacy rights and stuff like that?
So here's what's going to end up happening, though, right? Similar to crypto technology, AI is going to become export controlled. It's going to be viewed as a weapon, and you're just going to have to see different worlds that build up around that. And there is going to be a Chinese AI and a Russian one, and an Iranian one, US one, Western European one. I think that's how that's going to break down. And this is why, certain nation states are nervous that they're not going to see, some of the best work out there and they're hacking each other to death in order to download those plans, those models, those engines. And that's what's going to end up happening. Sure, we're going to have the regulated side where people are worried about what these things do and what they decide. But then you're going to have a whole part of it that's going to be export control, which makes certain folks nervous, like Microsoft, right? Because they have an AI lab there. It doesn't make Google nervous, right? Because they pulled out of that market, but it makes NVIDIA nervous, right? Because they sell a lot of their gear over there. And so the industry is going to have to react, and Wall Street will react. Maybe we reach the peak of tech company valuations because a whole part of the world isn't going to be their market anymore. And you saw early battles between Cisco and Huawei on that, where networking gear is PNG'd in China and vice versa. And maybe there's just going to be other elements of the tech stack that are going to be off limits to each other. Nowhere in our plans do we think that we would ever be able to sell to China and vice versa. No Chinese AI company thinks that they'll be able to sell into the US. Look, even things that are relatively innocent, such as WeChats and TikToks and stuff like that, are going to be blockaded, from our ecosystems.
Well, already the TSA agents aren't allowed to have TikTok on their phone, right?
Yeah. Well, you had the CFIUS thing when they were trying to buy certain dating apps and what have you, because they're worried about the sensitivity of revealing the personal lives of service members and what have you. So that's just going to get more.
Where are you getting the notion of export controls? I mean, is this just in your networking and what you're feeling, your finger on the pulse?
Well, publicly, NVIDIA and Microsoft have been reacting to hints that those types of things are coming and saying, no, we're entangled with China, we need them, and blah, blah, blah. Not everybody's doing bad things like trying to leverage AI to, turn off power grids and guide nuclear weapons. The problem is not just AI, every piece of technology is dual use, right? So even Pokemon Go is dual use. If you want to understand what's inside of a military base, you know what you do? You drop a Pokemon character in the center of it, and sooner or later, some kid or somebody else is going to stumble onto that base or around it and take pictures for you. Everything's impacted by military and intelligence applications as well. But people are trying to figure out how to put walls around some of this tech. And I don't know if the genie's out of the bottle already. And that's the duality also between open source and proprietary stack. Yeah. Is there's so much out there that's open source. People can cobble together, a Chinese version of an Amazon Echo, and they did that, right? People will be able to cobble together a Chinese version of our work, and there's analogs of Microsoft Windows and everything else you can think of. There's analogs of the iPhone over there. It's sort of like imagining that there's water on Mars and humans living there, and then just letting evolution take its stance there, and then coming back in 100 or 1,000 years and seeing something that seems familiar but alien at the same time. And that's what happens when you go overseas and see how they evolve. They're fascinating to watch. Most people are decent, right? The vast majority of folks don't worry about dual use, and they don't worry about military applications of our technologies and stuff like that. The vast majority of humanity does what? They go to school, they take care of their families, they interact with their friends, they go to work, they pay their taxes. That is the vast majority of the world. But unfortunately, there's some bad actors out there, and they just do a lot more. It would be nice to be a tech company that gets funded, where we can leverage the fruits of our labors in order to increase the size of our staff, pay our taxes, grow, and get the future rewards, and eventually become philanthropic and the like. I think we're all agitated when we have to worry about defending ourselves from cybersecurity because somebody wants to unlock our door and just grab source code. That may sound like an HBO show. Maybe that's not as prevalent, but I think it's more prevalent than we'd like it to be.
Yeah.
This was great, Igor.
Thank you very much, Igor. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.